trucks arrived. Not enough at first. Women waited in lines that barely moved. Some stood, some sat on the ground, some stared straight ahead, trying not to cry. Others whispered to each other, sharing rumors like fragile comforts. One rumor said British camps were harsh and strict. Another said women would be interrogated for days. Another said food would be withheld. None of these rumors were confirmed, but all of them felt real. As the trucks filled, the women climbed aboard without protest. The wooden benches were hard, the sides were open. The road passed slowly beneath them. Villages slid by in silence. War damage was everywhere. Burned houses, broken bridges, empty fields. This landscape felt like a farewell. Several diaries describe this moment with the same detail. The sound of the engine, the cold air, the feeling of leaving something behind without knowing what it was. One woman wrote that she did not cry because she was afraid tears would make her seem weak. Weakness felt dangerous. Inside the trucks, no one spoke loudly. Conversation stayed low and careful. Women avoided drawing attention to themselves. They tried to appear obedient, proper, invisible. Years of training had taught them that survival came from compliance. As the convoy moved, British soldiers rode along. Some sat quietly, some smoked, some watched the road. Few looked directly at the prisoners. This absence of attention created tension. The women did not know if they were being judged or ignored. Both possibilities were frightening. The destination was not announced. When the trucks finally slowed, the women saw fences, barracks, watchtowers, or sometimes only tents and wire. The sight confirmed their fears. This was a camp. But what kind of camp, they did not know. For many women, this was the moment fear became physical. Hands shook, throats tightened, thoughts raced ahead to imagined futures. They did not resist, they did not argue, they waited. The order to gather personal belongings came quickly. Sometimes it was just a few minutes, sometimes an hour. Often women carried everything they owned in one small bag. A change of clothes, a photograph, a piece of bread, a letter folded many times. They did not know if they would see their homes again. British orders were usually brief, direct, without explanation. This lack of explanation was often more frightening than anger would have been. Silence left room for imagination, and imagination, shaped by years of propaganda, filled the gap. One woman later wrote that the British officer did not raise his voice. This confused her. She had expected shouting. When none came, she felt even more afraid. Calm did not fit the image she had been taught. The journey into captivity began slowly. Groups of women were assembled, sometimes in schoolyards, sometimes in barns, sometimes by the roadside. There was waiting, long waiting, hours with nothing to do but think. Thoughts turned inward. What would happen at the camps? Would they be punished? Would they be separated? Would they be used for labor? No one answered these questions. British guards did not explain their plans. They simply followed procedure. As the Allied armies moved east, this fear followed them. It sat in kitchens, in shelters, in half-empty schools. It whispered during sleepless nights. It shaped expectations long before any British soldier was seen. For women who would later become prisoners, this expectation was already part of daily thought. Diaries from early 1945 show this clearly. One young woman from Hamburg wrote that she feared capture more than death, not because she had seen anything herself, but because she had heard the same warnings since childhood. Another woman, working as a radio operator near the Dutch border, wrote that British captivity would mean cold eyes and endless punishment. None of them described personal experience. They described belief. As Germany's military structure collapsed, order gave way to confusion. Units dissolved. Evacuation plans failed. Civilians moved west, then east, then stopped entirely. Women who had once lived under clear rules now faced sudden commands from strangers. Some were told to stay where they were. Some were told to leave immediately. Some were told nothing at all. When British troops arrived, the moment of contact was often quiet. There was no dramatic announcement, no shouting. Often it was just a vehicle stopping, boots on gravel, a short command given in broken German. In April 1945, the war in Europe was breaking apart, day by day, road by road. For many German women, the sound of artillery was moving closer. Trains were overcrowded, orders changed without warning, rumors moved faster than truth, and somewhere between fear and exhaustion, thousands of women were taken into custody by British forces, unsure of what would happen next. They did not know where they were going. They did not know how they would be treated. They only knew what they had been told for years. This is the story of what they expected, not what happened yet, but what they believed was coming. By the spring of 1945, German society had been under pressure for almost 6 years. Air raids had emptied cities. Food had grown scarce. Families were scattered. Many men were gone, either fighting or already missing. Women had taken on roles that once seemed unthinkable: factory work, civil defense, nursing, administration, logistics, clerical duties, and in some cases, military auxiliary service. Some of these women wore uniforms, some did not. Some were deeply political, many were not. But all of them had grown up under a system that spoke constantly about enemies, about danger, about humiliation if Germany lost. British soldiers, in particular, were described in strict, simple terms: cold, arrogant, ruthless, a nation that remembered the last war and would now seek revenge. This message was repeated in newspapers, radio broadcasts, and training materials, not with detail, but with certainty. Fear did not need detail. It only needed repetition. As they dismounted, the order came again. Line up, stand still, wait. British soldiers counted them, checked names if lists were available. Often, lists were incomplete or missing entirely. This administrative confusion added to the anxiety. If the British did not even know who they were holding, what would happen to those who disappeared into paperwork? Some women feared being accused of things they had not done. Others feared that their past work would be misunderstood. A secretary worried that typing orders would be seen as criminal. A nurse worried that treating wounded soldiers would be seen as loyalty. Fear was not rational. It was constant. The first night in captivity was often spent in temporary quarters: a gymnasium, a warehouse, a converted school. The women slept close together. There were no beds at first, just floors, blankets if they were lucky. Sleep did not come easily. The sound of unfamiliar footsteps outside kept many awake. The quiet was different from air raid nights. There were no sirens, no explosions, just waiting. Waiting was worse. In the darkness, thoughts returned to childhood lessons, to warnings given by teachers and officials, to posters that showed enemy soldiers as cruel and mocking. These images had never been tested against reality before. Now they waited for confirmation. Morning brought new orders, usually calm, usually short, sometimes delivered by interpreters, sometimes with gestures. The women were told to wash, to assemble again, to prepare for transfer. Transfer meant movement. Movement meant uncertainty. As releases slowly began, women packed the same small bags they had arrived with. The act felt different now. They knew what awaited them on the other side would be harder than captivity. Rebuilding belief was harder than enduring fear. On departure days, there were no speeches, just names called, documents checked, gates opened. Some women looked back, not at the guards, but at the place where their expectations had been dismantled. One diary ends with a simple sentence: "I was more afraid before I arrived than while I was there." This was the lasting consequence. Not gratitude, not forgiveness, but understanding. Understanding that fear can be built carefully over years and dismantled quietly without force. For these women, captivity did not become the story they expected. Instead, it became a moment where belief met reality and had to change. And in that change, silence spoke louder than punishment ever could. That is how the unexpected British order stayed with them. Not as a command, but as a contrast. A reminder that the human mind can be imprisoned long before the body is. Eventually, letters were allowed. Short, censored, but real. Writing home forced the women to choose words carefully. How do you describe captivity that does not match expectation? Many avoided description altogether. They wrote only that they were alive, that they were safe. Safety was a word they had not expected to use. As spring turned to summer, the war officially ended. The news reached the camp quietly. No celebration, no despair, just confirmation. Germany had lost. The women reacted differently. Some cried, some felt numb, some felt relief that uncertainty was over. But captivity remained. Now the fear shifted again. What would happen after? Release was discussed but not promised. Screening processes were explained, investigations, repatriation plans. Again, explanation replaced threat. This continued to reshape perception. One woman later wrote that captivity forced her to think for the first time without slogans, without warnings, without collective fear, alone with her own thoughts. That solitude was difficult. The British order that had once terrified them now framed their days. Wake, work, eat, sleep. The order was external, but it allowed internal quiet. In that quiet, many confronted memories of belief, of obedience, of silence during earlier years. The camp did not teach them these thoughts. Time did. Touch was careful, professional. Some women cried during these examinations, not from pain, but from release. Being handled without fear broke something inside them. Others felt anger. Why now? Why kindness after defeat? These mixed reactions existed side by side. As weeks passed, the women began to understand the nature of their captivity. They were prisoners, but not targets. They were contained, but not condemned. This distinction changed everything. Some women felt shame, not for their past actions, but for their expectations. They had believed stories that reduced others to monsters. Seeing those stories dissolve created emptiness. What replaces belief when belief collapses? Diaries from this period reflect deep internal questioning. One woman wrote that she did not know how to hate anymore. Another wrote that she felt embarrassed when a guard smiled politely. Politeness felt like accusation. The British guards, for their part, maintained distance. Friendly gestures were limited. Rules were enforced evenly. This professionalism prevented emotional confusion, but also prevented hatred from forming. The women existed in a strange middle space. Not forgiven, not punished, just held. Letters and diaries written later describe this period as mentally exhausting, not because of suffering, but because of contradiction. The mind had to reconcile two images that could not exist together: enemy as monster, enemy as orderly human. One woman wrote that she felt betrayed by her own thoughts. She had prepared herself for cruelty and felt foolish for being relieved. Relief felt like weakness. Conversations among the women slowly changed. At first, they spoke only in whispers, sharing fears. Later, they began sharing observations. Who seemed fair? Which guard spoke a few German words? Which routines never changed? These details grounded them. Grounding reduced fear. One afternoon, a British officer addressed the women through an interpreter. He explained camp rules, curfews, hygiene expectations, work schedules, consequences for violations. He did not threaten them. He did not justify their captivity. He simply explained. Several women later wrote that this moment stayed with them. Explanation had been rare in their lives. Orders usually came without reason. Here, reason existed. That was unsettling. Food portions remained basic but consistent. No one starved, no one was overfed. Hunger existed, but it was predictable. Predictability mattered. One woman wrote that knowing she would receive bread every evening allowed her to sleep without panic for the first time in months. Panic had been constant before. Medical checks followed. British medics examined the women, treated infections, wrapped bandages, recorded weights. The registration process was slow. British personnel asked questions through interpreters. The tone remained neutral. Answers were written down carefully. No accusations followed. No reactions were shown. This neutrality confused the women deeply. If guilt was assumed, why ask questions at all? As days passed, camp life settled into a rhythm. Wake up, wash, assemble, eat, wait. Sometimes work assignments were given. Cleaning areas, sorting supplies, kitchen assistance. The work was supervised but not harshly enforced. Breaks existed. Instructions were clear. This predictability slowly weakened the women's internal defenses. One woman noted that she stopped rehearsing answers in her head after the third day. There was no interrogation, no pressure. The fear machinery inside her began to slow. That frightened her, because if fear was wrong, then everything she had been taught was wrong too. Some women resisted this realization. They stayed distant, avoided eye contact, spoke little. They warned others not to relax. They said this calm could not last. Others began to observe more closely. They noticed that British guards rotated shifts, that they followed strict rules, that they punished small violations like stepping outside assigned areas, but did so without anger. Punishment, when it occurred, was administrative, loss of privileges, extra duties, never shouting, never public humiliation. This did not match expectation. The women began to notice small details. A British guard adjusted a loose board on a step. Another corrected a sign that had fallen. These actions were ordinary, almost boring, but boredom itself felt unreal after years of fear. Food came later that day. Soup, bread, a ladle placed carefully into each bowl. The women watched closely. No one was singled out. No one was denied. Several women hesitated before eating. One diary mentions a woman who waited until others had finished just to see if something would happen to them first. Nothing did. The soup was thin, but it was warm. That warmth reached places fear had lived for years. Still, belief does not vanish in one moment. The women ate quietly. No one thanked the guards. Gratitude felt dangerous, as if acknowledging kindness might invite disappointment later. That night, sleep came more easily than expected. Not deep sleep, but rest. Bodies that had lived under constant alarm finally paused. Some women woke suddenly, expecting shouting or alarms. There were none. Morning arrived with another routine. Line up, count, instructions for the day. The women were told they would undergo registration, names, birth dates, previous occupations. This caused a new wave of anxiety. Paperwork meant judgment. One woman wrote that she practiced saying her job title repeatedly, choosing the simplest version each time. Not radio assistant, just clerk. Not military nurse, just hospital worker. Fear reshaped identity. In April 1945, as the women were led past the inner gate of the camp, the pause inside them began to break. They had crossed the line they feared most. Now there was no more imagining what captivity might be. Now there was only what it was. The first surprise was silence. Not the silence of threat, but the silence of routine. Inside the camp, there was movement, but no chaos. Guards walked assigned paths. Orders were given, but without shouting. Women were directed to specific areas, counted again, and told to wait. The tone did not change. For many, this felt wrong. Years of expectation had prepared them for anger, for punishment, for humiliation. But instead, they encountered process. Clipboards, lists, scheduled meals, designated washing times. One woman later wrote that this made her more uneasy than cruelty would have. Cruelty would have confirmed what she believed. This did not. The women were assigned to barracks, plain wooden buildings. Inside, there were bunks, thin mattresses, shared blankets. Nothing comfortable, nothing deliberately harsh. The room smelled of damp wood and many bodies. Still, it was shelter. Some women sat down immediately, exhausted. Others stood, unsure if sitting was allowed. A few remained near the door, as if expecting to be called out at any moment. No one was. Time passed slowly. Minutes stretched. Nothing happened. That was the second surprise. Their expectations were heavy. Years of instruction had built them carefully. Enemy equals danger. Captivity equals suffering. Order equals deception. As the train continued, the women looked at each other, faces thin, eyes tired, but also watchful. Each was measuring the situation, comparing belief with observation. The difference was unsettling. When the train finally stopped for a longer period, the women were told to disembark. The camp ahead looked more permanent. Barbed wire, guard posts, clearly marked areas. This felt final. They lined up once more. Names were taken, personal items were inspected. Nothing was taken harshly, but the process itself was enough to raise heartbeats. This was the threshold. Everything they believed about British captivity stood on one side. Everything they did not yet know stood on the other. As they were led toward the inner area of the camp, one woman later wrote that she felt a strange calm. Not relief, not fear, but stillness, as if her mind had paused. This pause marked the end of expectation. The next moments would begin something else entirely. And that is where this part ends. As days passed, the pattern repeated. Line up, count, move, wait. The women began to notice details they had not expected. British soldiers followed routines. They wrote reports. They checked watches. They enforced rules, but not randomly. This orderliness created confusion. If the enemy was supposed to be brutal, why was everything so procedural? This question stayed unspoken. It was too early to trust impressions. One diary notes that kindness could be a trick. Calm could hide cruelty. Belief did not disappear easily. One woman described rehearsing answers in her head constantly. Her name, her age, her job. She practiced saying she was only a clerk, as if repeating it enough times might make it safe. Others prepared for punishment. They expected shouting, interrogation, public humiliation. Each quiet hour felt like the calm before something terrible. Food was distributed in basic portions. Bread, soup, nothing generous, nothing cruel, just enough. But even this caused anxiety. Some women did not eat immediately, fearing it might be taken away later. Hunger became something to control, not satisfy. Control felt like safety. Letters were not allowed. Contact with family was impossible. The women felt suspended between identities, no longer civilians, not yet prisoners of war, something undefined. This undefined state was deeply unsettling. British orders continued to be brief. Sometimes a guard would say, later. Sometimes, tomorrow. These words stretched time. Tomorrow could mean anything. As transportation resumed, the women were moved again, this time by train. The wagons were not sealed. There was air, light, but the memory of other wartime transports made the women tense. They did not speak about it, but many thought about it. The train moved slowly. Stops were frequent. Each stop raised new fears. Would this be the place where things changed? Where punishment began? Nothing happened. Still, the women waited.